You're not tired because you've said too much. You're tired because you keep explaining yourself to people who never truly saw you, people who glance through your words as though you're made of glass, seeing only what they choose and leaving the rest untouched, unnoticed, unread. You explain your silence so it doesn't come across as cold or distant, your boundaries so they don't seem selfish or harsh, and your pain just enough so that others feel comfortable. Yet with every careful explanation, every softened phrase, every apology for things that require none, something inside you becomes quieter. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the slow, aching quiet of someone gradually losing pieces of themselves. You shrink your words and dull your sharp edges. You dress up your truth in cautious disclaimers and hesitant pauses, making yourself smaller, safer, easier to digest, believing that if only you package your honesty carefully enough, others might finally accept it without resistance or rejection. But here's the harsh truth. No one ever told you clearly enough. Every time you water down your words to protect someone else's comfort, you lose a layer of your own clarity, your own authenticity. Your very voice begins to fade, until one day you struggle to remember what it sounded like when you spoke freely. Because people rarely listen with the intention to genuinely understand. More often, they listen just enough to remain comfortable, just enough to hold their illusions intact. And if your truth doesn't align perfectly with their neatly constructed narratives, they'll reshape your words, not because you're wrong, but precisely because you're real. And reality is unsettling in a world built upon polite fictions and convenient masks. Nietzsche saw this clearly long before you ever did. He wrote, "Those who walk their own path must be willing to do so alone, not because solitude was the goal, not because isolation was somehow noble, but because he knew the harshest truth of all. Your deepest honesty was never meant to fit neatly into scripts of mass approval. True authenticity demands courage. Courage to risk misunderstanding. Courage to risk standing apart. You've spent so much of your life translating yourself for people who were never equipped to grasp your complexity, performing tirelessly in rooms that only ever applauded your silence. And afterwards, you wonder why you feel invisible, overlooked, exhausted. Why, after all the effort, you still feel as though you've never truly been heard. But maybe this exhaustion is the point. Perhaps you're drained not because your essence is too intense, too complicated, or too much, but because you've been freely giving away your truth to people who never had the capacity, never had the intention, never even had the desire to carry it. So let me ask you something you've probably feared asking yourself for a very long time. What happens to you, the real you, the one beneath all the carefully constructed performances, when you finally stop explaining yourself? What happens when you stop explaining yourself, not in a grand gesture or a loud announcement, but quietly, in those subtle moments when you choose honesty over comfort, silence over meaningless chatter, authenticity over performance? At first, it seems like nothing at all. Just a faint shift in the air, a subtle pause that hangs after your sentences, as though the rhythm of every conversation has slightly changed its tune. You notice how your quiet truths no longer blend effortlessly into their comfort zones, how the air around you feels colder, not because you have suddenly grown distant, but because you've stopped warming it with the carefully crafted versions of yourself that others had grown accustomed to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something begins to unravel. Relationships you once thought were strong start to reveal their fragility, not because of conflict or confrontation, but because they were never anchored in truth, only in your quiet willingness to compromise, to keep the peace, to hold everything neatly together by adjusting your boundaries to fit someone else's comfort. You begin to see how often you held conversations together, how often you laughed at jokes that never touched you, how often you nodded quietly when you wanted to disagree, how often you made yourself available for others' crises, even as you quietly faced your own. And now, without your constant effort, without your careful translations of yourself into something easily digestible, some of these connections simply dissolve, not with anger or clear endings, but quietly, in an uneasy, gradual fade. And though it aches in a way that's hard to describe, this distance feels strangely honest, as though for the first time you're truly seeing what was always there beneath the surface. Connections that existed not out of genuine closeness or mutual understanding, but out of emotional convenience, routine habits, and shared distractions. You realize painfully that these weren't people who truly saw you. They were people who simply enjoyed the familiar rhythm you provided, the reassuring presence, the dependable emotional space you held open, the consistent and comfortable silence you carefully preserved. Nietzsche once wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." And now those words ring painfully true, not because you've become isolated, but because you're finally aware of how deeply you've been shaped by the silent expectations of others. Because the tribe doesn't always attack loudly. Sometimes, it gently rewards you for abandoning parts of yourself, for presenting only those layers that fit neatly into its quiet, unspoken standards. It rewards your silence, your politeness, your adaptability, and subtly punishes your honesty, your complexity, your refusal to compromise your truth. So when the day arrives that you finally stop bending yourself into shapes that aren't yours, when you cease translating yourself just to gain acceptance, you're left facing the stark reality that some relationships were never genuinely close. They were only close to the carefully controlled performance you'd grown so accustomed to providing. Yes, it hurts. Not simply because you're losing people, but because now you realize with piercing clarity that you never truly had them to begin with. You were alone, even when surrounded by familiar faces, even when laughter filled the air, even in rooms that felt crowded. The loneliness wasn't from solitude, but from hiding your true self behind a comforting illusion, afraid of what would happen if that illusion slipped away. Yet as painful as this awareness is, it brings a kind of liberation, a strange sense of calm, a newfound clarity. This isn't loneliness in the traditional sense. This is seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the quiet truth behind the facade of connection. And once you've glimpsed this deeper reality, once you've seen beyond the comforting veil of illusion, you can't unsee it. You stop chasing approval. You stop bending yourself into agreeable shapes. You stop explaining, justifying, performing. And in that space, in that profound and quiet stillness, you finally begin to hear the sound of your own presence, real, honest, and complete, no longer trying desperately to be understood, but simply existing, breathing freely, perhaps for the first time. It's easy to say you're done explaining yourself, to promise quietly that you'll never again shape your truth around the comfort of others, that you'll walk away from people who never fully understood you, that you'll finally cut ties with spaces that required you to constantly shrink. But the reality isn't nearly that simple, is it? Because even after the decisive silence settles, even after you've stopped softening your sentences and apologizing for simply existing, even after you've told yourself firmly that you no longer care what anyone thinks, there's still something hidden beneath the surface, something quiet yet powerful, subtle yet suffocating, an almost invisible voice whispering gently at the back of your mind. What if they were right about you all along? What if your value really does depend on being understood? What if you're only lovable when your edges are smoothed, your truth simplified, your voice carefully moderated? You don't often admit it, but you've felt that fear countless times. That sudden discomfort tightening in your chest when someone misinterprets your words or misjudges your intentions. That powerful, almost irresistible impulse to clarify yourself, not from the need to be praised, but from the sheer terror of being judged as someone you never truly were. You tell yourself you're beyond caring, yet some hidden part of you still desperately seeks acceptance, because somewhere along your journey, perhaps in childhood, perhaps during those crucial years when you first tried navigating relationships and friendships, you learned that pleasing others meant belonging, and belonging meant safety, security, and a sense of worthiness that you've quietly chased ever since. So gradually, almost imperceptibly, you became fluent in self-editing, hiding away your strongest opinions, camouflaging your deepest emotions, suppressing your boldest dreams, not out of dishonesty or deceit, but simply because you believed that the truest, most vibrant parts of your soul might be too complicated, too overwhelming, too intense for others to handle. And the thought of risking rejection for showing your genuine self was too painful to bear. That's the fear beneath your explanations, the deep-rooted dread not just of being misunderstood, but of being rejected precisely because of your honesty. It's the quiet anxiety that whispers, you'll end up isolated, unwanted, forgotten if you dare to stand openly in your authenticity, without apology or compromise. Nietzsche never wrote for those who craved approval or carefully walked the delicate line between acceptance and authenticity. He wrote instead for those courageous enough to abandon the constant need for validation, for those ready to stand exposed in their raw, unfiltered truths, fully aware of the discomfort, loneliness, and judgment that might follow. Nietzsche understood that the greatest danger was never in being misunderstood by others, but rather in living a life so thoroughly filtered and carefully adjusted that you lose touch with your own voice, your own thoughts, your own true reflection. And you recognize this danger, don't you? You know intimately what it feels like when someone casually asks how you're doing, and you simply say, fine, even though your heart feels heavy, even though 1,000 complicated emotions swirl inside you, because fine is safer, simpler, less demanding. You know the emptiness after a conversation when you hold back the words that matter most, the words that linger unspoken in your throat, the truth you quietly swallow to preserve harmony, to maintain a fragile peace. It's exhausting, this endless performance, this constant editing of your inner landscape, not simply because it demands energy, but because every act of self-censorship, every unspoken word and hidden feeling teaches your nervous system that honesty is dangerous, that authenticity comes with unbearable consequences, that your truth, if fully expressed, might leave you isolated and alone. But what if that fear is no longer relevant? What if it's an echo from an outdated past, from people who never had the capacity or desire to truly understand you? People who were never meant to hold your complexity or witness your depth? What if the silence you now feel isn't emptiness, isn't abandonment, but a necessary pause? An essential space in which, for the first time, your true self might finally breathe freely. Because the moment you stop needing everyone else to understand, approve, or validate you, something deeper, quieter, yet infinitely stronger emerges. The gentle realization that perhaps you were never meant to be completely transparent or easily digestible, never meant to fit into neat categories or simplified labels, never meant to be understood by everyone at once. Perhaps your greatest strength lies not in being universally understood, but in having the courage to remain real, even if it means standing alone, even if it means enduring temporary isolation and uncertainty. Because it's in those quiet, solitary moments, not the crowded rooms filled with half-truths and gentle lies, where you finally reconnect with the most profound parts of yourself, the truths that have always lived within you, waiting patiently beneath your layers of performance, waiting for you to finally stop explaining and simply start existing, fully, fearlessly, without compromise. There is a moment, quiet, subtle, and profoundly transformative, that doesn't arrive with applause or sudden clarity, nor with neat closure or perfect timing, but simply unfolds gently within you. When you finally understand, you have nothing left to prove to anyone. It arrives without ceremony, without drama, without bitterness or anger. Instead, it's a quiet letting go, a surrender not born out of defeat, but out of an inner knowing that your value no longer hinges upon how others perceive or misperceive you. Have you felt this yet? That silent shift when you realize there's no longer an argument to win, no longer a perfect version of yourself to protect or defend, no longer any urgency to control the way your words are interpreted, your intentions perceived, or your story received by those who were never fully listening anyway. You simply release it. You stop rewriting your past so it becomes easier for others to accept or digest. You stop shrinking your opinions or softening your voice just to avoid discomfort. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, preparing for misunderstandings that might never happen, and defending yourself against judgments that might never come. And in the quiet that follows, in the emptiness left behind by the constant noise of performing, You hear something you haven't truly heard in a very long time. Your own voice, pure and clear, undistorted by expectations or pressures or demands, unfiltered by the fears and doubts that once defined your every interaction. It doesn't shout. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't plead or bargain for attention or acceptance. It simply speaks, clearly, directly, honestly, only when there's something truly worth saying. And in this newfound silence, this calm that emerges when you no longer rush to explain or justify your existence, you discover a rare and powerful presence within you. A presence rooted not in the anxious pursuit of acceptance, but in the quiet confidence of someone who has finally stopped performing for approval. You've realized by now, haven't you, that explaining yourself was never protection. It only prolonged the inevitable departure of people who were never meant to stay. It only delayed rejection from those who weren't truly aligned with you to begin with. It only kept you trapped in spaces that demanded you to slowly disappear, piece by painful piece, until you barely recognized who you'd become. And haven't you given away enough already? So now, you simply stop. You enter rooms without bending your posture or lowering your eyes. You speak what you genuinely mean, or you embrace silence fully and unapologetically. You allow others to misunderstand you, misinterpret you, even dismiss you, and you resist the urge to chase their understanding, knowing now deep within yourself that your truth was never meant to be a collective project. Your clarity, your authenticity, your essence, these belong solely to you. Nietzsche once wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." And perhaps you've finally seen what he meant. You've spent far too much of your life desperately explaining the freedom and expansiveness of the sky to people who never had any intention of leaving the comfortable safety of the ground. You've tried so hard to describe flight to those who never wanted wings, and in doing so, you stayed tethered, grounded, and limited. But no longer. Now you soar quietly. You speak less, but with infinitely greater impact. You choose your moments, your company, your words, and you honor your silence as fiercely as your truth. You no longer explain the sky. You simply inhabit it, embody it, live within its endless expansiveness without apology, without needing others to affirm that you belong there. And somewhere within that silence, within the gentle yet firm boundaries you've learned to set, something remarkable happens. You become someone unforgettable, not because you were louder, more persuasive, or more charismatic, but precisely because you no longer cared about being unforgettable at all. Let me ask you one final question, something to carry with you beyond these words. What would your life feel like if you finally stopped explaining? If you stopped trying so hard to be understood by everyone? If you trusted fully that the right people will recognize you even in silence? If you embrace the peace that comes from simply existing exactly as you are, without asking permission? Because in that quiet, courageous moment, that's when your real life truly begins.